Hello and welcome to another episode of Tara Talks. Today, my guest, is Scott Stockdale, the brains behind the Entrepreneurs Can Party Top 10 rated podcast. And when I saw the name of this podcast, I knew we were going to get on just fine, and I was really excited to learn more. Scott's passion and expertise is helping entrepreneurs plan, launch, and scale a podcast, and that's what we're going to dive right into today. So, Scott, it is great to have you, and thank you for coming on Tara Talks.
You're most welcome, Tara, and thank you so much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. You are the first male guest, so welcome.
Thank you.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about you and how you got into doing what you're doing now.
Sure. So yeah, podcasting for me has been a love for a number of years. So I fell into it when I was at university, listened to the likes of Tim Ferriss, Gary Vee, who I'm sure you're familiar with yourself. And I just fell in love with this idea that I could walk to uni, which took like 30 minutes, and just listen to some like really great content, just valuable tips left, right and center. And particularly people like Tim, who it's not just about business, but for them, it's about mindset and personal development and all this good stuff. And I was like, yeah, I love this. So for years, I listened to them for a number of years. And then eventually it kind of got to the point where I was like, you know what, I'd quite like to do this as well. I'd like to get into this podcasting game. Had no idea how to do it. So I sought out a mentor who taught me the ropes. And he's got a number one ranked podcast in many countries around the world, all about entrepreneurship. So I figured, you know what, if he's done that, then he's a great person to learn from. So I took part in his course, which was 12 weeks long. And fast forward to March 2020, the podcast Entrepreneurs Can Party, it launched and got into the top 10 in 6 days, which was insane. I had no idea that was going to happen. And there was a lot of kind of steps leading up to that, which I'm obviously more than happy to kind of dive into and into the weeds as much as you'd like to. But that in a very short sort of nutshell is how I got into podcasting and why I love it so much.
Amazing, I love that. Now we can't let the podcast name slip by without a mention. So Entrepreneurs Can Party, I absolutely love it. Where did that come from? What's the story behind that name?
Well, thank you so much. It was it took a long time. So essentially I was looking for a few things from my podcast name. I wanted to include entrepreneurs in there just for SEO benefit, because that's what I do in my day job. So I figured there might be some SEO benefit, you know, if people are looking for entrepreneurship podcasts, then it makes sense that that would be in the title. I want it to be very short and snappy. So one of my favorite podcasts is Masters of Scale by Reid Hoffman. And I quite like this idea of just having 3 words. It's like something. I was like, okay, entrepreneurs is in there. Okay, that eliminates 1 word. Then I just got to find 2 other words. And those other 2 words took me way too long to come up with. But I figured, you know what, I want it to be fun. I want it to be about bringing on guests who are living their best lives, having so much fun in their businesses. So I figured, okay, maybe there's some sort of fun element, party, there we go. And then I was like, okay, I want it to be empowering. And I figured quite an empowering, I don't know quite a grammatical word, but it's like one of those, like a can-do sort of positive verb, isn't it? So I was like, okay, and that's just, quite organic in the end, but there's a lot of head-scratching, brainstorming evenings where I was just journaling and writing down many ideas. So it took a while, but thank you. I appreciate that you like it.
I like that. And I just sort of love the sort of messaging behind it, because I think so often people think that entrepreneurship has to be, you know, working all the hours, burning out, and it actually doesn't. I went up to Leeds to see one of my best friends on Friday. We were drinking Prosecco out in the garden at like 3:30 on Friday, and we were just thinking, this is great, isn't it? And it's great that this is what we're creating. We're creating a business that we can run on our terms that enables us to do that. And if we want to have the Friday off to go and do that together, and that's what our vision of success looks like, then that's amazing, isn't it? So again, where did that sort of desire to talk about, you know, entrepreneurs can do this and they can have fun and they can party, you know, is there a story a bit deeper than that sort of brought that title to the surface?
Yeah, so you make some really great points, in the fact that I realised as well, having spoken to previous guests from my other podcast that I did, which was, I see it as almost like a dummy run now, but that gave me the opportunity to speak to people who I wanted to speak to first and foremost, but people who were, as it turned out, actually having fun and living these lifestyles that, like you kind of touched on, you can have a drink at the weekend, you don't have to be working like 20-30 hours a day. And, you know, obviously I think I suppose there's a balance to be struck. I suppose in the beginning, you know, you probably do have to put in that work, and actually, you know, it's not a walk in a park. And even people now I speak to are having fun in their businesses. they're still working it crazily hard. So I think there's definitely a balance to be had, but at the same time, I don't think this hustle culture is necessarily something that you have to kind of strive for. I think a balance can be struck. So that was, yeah, kind of how I guess kind of got into it and how I wanted to talk about it more. And some of the guests that I had on my previous podcast have actually featured on Entrepreneurs Can Party. A guy called Josh, for example, who's actually my cousin, but he has an insane business. So he and his best mate from school, they essentially create videos for companies like Panasonic, Lumix, STA Travel, MTV, even some tourism boards like Visit Australia. So they create these videos for these companies, go around the world traveling with their best mates whilst doing it, parties non-stop. And I was like, wow, okay, let's get him on the podcast. Let's find out what his secrets are, if you like, and what are the kind of things that he's learned from doing all this. And there's been so many examples, like a TikTok DJ artist who's got like close to 1 million followers, and she essentially DJs for a living around America. And even now during these times, like she's doing stuff on TikTok and actually having these virtual DJ sessions and having just a whale of a time. So yeah, it's been fascinating hearing these stories. And I guess that is why I've kind of got into it so much, and just I've been inspired by these people who've come onto the show.
Love it. So you mentioned that you successfully launched your podcast in March and got to top 10 in 6 days, which is just massive congratulations. I would absolutely love it if you could just talk us through that sort of planning phase, because obviously we know that to actually launch something successfully, it's all in the planning, isn't it? So what does that sort of planning roadmap look like for somebody that's looking to launch a podcast?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. A lot of planning involved. The podcast course that I mentioned, podcast launch program of Alex Chisnell, who's a fantastic podcast host, and that podcast program lasted 12 weeks, and that began, I think it was beginning of November or around that time, 2019. So I figured, okay, let's work backwards. When will that program finish? I think it was around mid-February. I figured I'd probably want a couple of weeks to implement the learnings, because I wasn't going to do it all simultaneously whilst learning. So I was like, okay, give myself a couple of weeks, meaning I'd have like a launch date of beginning of March, essentially. And then I was like working backwards from there. I was like, okay, what do I need in place in order to have a successful launch? So obviously episodes, I needed guests. So I needed to outreach to people and bring those people onto the show, record those episodes and edit them all and get all that production-wise sorted. Just on that, I think the reason I think I had at least 10 episodes in the can, so to speak, before I launched, because I wanted to focus on the promoting side rather than having to worry about creating content. So I always recommend that to people. It's like, okay, if you can have, say, a couple of months of content in the pipeline, so to speak, then that just takes the pressure off you. You can then focus all your efforts on promoting, because I've actually spoken to another really successful podcaster who says that you should be spending 80% of your time promoting your podcast, whether that's guesting on other shows or on your social media, and then 20% of the time actually creating the content. And I think a lot of podcasters that I've talked to actually get that the other way around. You know, they focus so much on making sure their podcast sounds perfect, and they've got to take out all the fillers, and they've got to make sure that all the intros are slick and all this sort of stuff, which obviously is a great thing. You want it to do that, but at the same time, it's better to get something out rather than being like the finished product. So the tangent there, but that was, yeah, so that was kind of my thought process. Okay, get the episodes in the can. And then in terms of the finer details, so obviously coming up with a name, that took way too long, but making sure that was in place, all the back end hosting, which I now use Buzzsprout, who are fantastic. They do cost £20 a month, but the services they provide and the affiliates they have and XYZ, they're a fantastic podcast host, make it super easy. Making sure the podcast is on all the relevant platforms, so the likes of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, Castbox, wherever you can get your podcast onto, making sure you do that, because people find your podcast in numerous different ways. And then other things, like I had various competitions leading up to the launch. So a week before the launch, I had a trailer episode, and I wanted to make a big song and dance about that. So I had a competition where I gave away 20 of my favorite books to one lucky person. And I had competitions to win a year's supply of Netflix, and just a few little cool things like that, just to kind of build that hype and get that excitement growing. They were the main things in terms of the production side, I think, of launching the podcast. And then when it came on to the promoting, so I mentioned the competitions during that launch week, I also very strategically, I might say, asked for reviews from friends and family. So I outreached to, I think it was about 300 people in my network over that first couple of weeks, literally DMing them in a, yeah, it was a lot of hard work, DMing people every single morning, I think about 30 people a day, just saying, oh, by the way, new podcast has launched, you might want to check it out. If you like what you hear, a review would be amazing, something on those words. And it managed to get not huge numbers. I think it got maybe 30 reviews in the first couple of days. And that just gave it that launch that it needed to get into that in the top 10. And it didn't quite make the new and noteworthy section of Apple Podcasts, which would have been incredible. But having said that, it still kind of has that credibility now of being that top 10 ranked podcast. And it made it easier for me to outreach to people who, you know, maybe in some ways are where I want to be, or a few steps ahead of where I want to be, not just in podcasting terms, but their own businesses, X, Y, Z. And it just makes it more compelling for me to ask them, it's like, okay, I've got top 10 rated podcast. I've had these people on who do incredible things. Would you like to come onto the show? And 9 times out of 10, I found that people are more than willing to do that. So appreciate that's a very long answer to a very short question, but happy to go into any more details of that if you like.
Oh, I love it. I love the idea of the competition as well, just sort of generate some interest. From the sort of promotion side, so I obviously do a lot of marketing coaching for my clients. Is there anything specific that you feel worked really well for your launch, whether it was a certain platform, whether it was doing live video, email marketing? Like, was there anything in particular that worked really well for you?
I think the main thing, which didn't actually come directly from the launch itself, but something I've been doing for the last couple of years consistently on Instagram and LinkedIn, is actually spending at least 20 minutes a day, not including Sundays, which I take a day off, but Monday through to Saturday, 20 minutes a day minimum, reaching out to people and just like engaging in their content. So whether that's leaving a message in their comments or, you know, sharing their stuff on the Instagram stories, whatever it might be, just showing that you are engaging in their content, not just like a generic, like, oh, lovely content, mate, keep going. It's more like, you know, it's more context specific. It's like, okay, I've actually engaged and actually listened or watched your content. So it's like, okay, I can't even give an example. It's very kind of tailored. So that is something I think probably above and beyond anything else I've done has been the biggest thing, I think, particularly in terms of outreaching. And that is something I always say to people. I think, it might have been JLD, podcaster I talked about earlier, he was saying that you've got to strive to understand before being understood. And for me, that's always stuck with me. And I thought that's a great way of framing this idea of outreaching and kind of being that force in your space and actually being a positive voice. So that's something I always try and do.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I think so many people, you know, they schedule their content and off it goes into Instagram. They might do the occasional story. They say, but I'm just not getting any traction. I'm not getting any eyes on my content, not getting any website hits, any followers. And I say to them, you know, are you actually being social on the social media platforms? Or are you like posting and ghosting? And yeah, well, my post has gone out for the day. Now I'm going to go off and do my daily life. And it actually is just actually engaging. Get your name popping up on people's content, start replying to their stories, start actually engaging with them and actually make them think, oh, who is this? I haven't heard of this person before. They'll repay the favor. They'll come and check you out. And I just think that is such a simple thing. Everyone can find 20 minutes in a day, can't they? While the kettle's boiling, while they're in the post office queue, while they're, I don't know, making dinner, like everybody can find that time, I am sure.
100%. I think
use and not just scrolling aimlessly.
Yeah, 100%. Just on that, a couple of things. So something I do so I don't just scroll endlessly, because there is always that temptation. I actually put a timer on my phone, usually 10 to 15 minutes, and it just says, okay, in this 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to only comment on other people's posts or look at their Instagram stories. I'm not going to look at my own content. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole. Or if I do, then it's like, okay, Scott, come on, get back to what you're doing. And so that's something I do. And then the other thing, like I say, 20 minutes, you could be in your lunch break. So even just today, I was outreaching to people on Instagram and shared a couple of stories, tagging a few people in who've done some really cool things. Just small things, if you do those every single day. I'm a big fan of a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and he talks about exactly this. It's like creating systems or having things in place to make these processes as easy as possible so you don't have to think about it. And for me, the outreaching in the morning, I have a routine which I won't go into too much detail because it's very long, but essentially I have these things that I do in the morning, and part of that is actually the outreach, and it comes after learning Spanish. So it's like, okay, once I've done Spanish, it's then switch my phone on and then I can start outreaching, and it's just an easy way for me to do that. I don't think about it, it just becomes very automatic.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Creating these sort of automatic habits. And I sort of have this so often with people when they're starting to use Instagram stories, and they say, I just keep forgetting. I just don't think of anything to put on there throughout the day. And I'm the polar opposite. And I'm just, everything I'm like, oh, could this be a story? Could this be a story? Again, it's creating that habit. And I haven't always been that way. But now I'm always sort of looking for things that can be content or story or inspiring or value. And it's just getting into that habit, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I like that. And I guess I know some of my friends, for example, they do that as well. One girl I'm thinking of particularly, Flo Zoe, an amazing yoga instructor, and she seems like really, really active on there. And she has talked to me before about how sometimes she feels the pressure to constantly be posting. And I'm kind of like, well, you know, you don't have to share every single detail if you don't want to. You know, you don't have to share that cup of tea you had at Betty's, or you don't have to share the picture of your dog rolling about in the grass. Like, obviously, if you want to show that personality, that's a great thing and it'll help you connect. But at the same time, you don't have to be on there 24/7. So I think that's why, you know, scheduling some time in the morning, it's like, okay, once you've done that, then it's like, okay, giving yourself permission to maybe coast throughout the rest of the day. Like, you don't have to go as hard throughout the day. For me, that's just been really useful because mentally, like, it kind of stimulates your mind so much and actually makes it hard to switch off, I think, if your phone's on all the time. So, you know, doing that and having some days off my phone, particularly, you know, not having it switched on at all, has been really helpful as well. So definitely a balance to be had, but yeah, 100% agree. If you can show those kind of details and those parts of yourself, it definitely helps you engage and connect more with people.
And I like getting out of the way first thing in the morning. I always say, you know, the income generating tasks or the priority tasks, you know, those that are moving the needle, they're taking you further to your goal, do them first thing, because then, like you said, it's done for the day. On to the next. You don't have to really worry about it again, do you?
Exactly. Yeah. Big fan of that as well. Eat the frog for breakfast, isn't it? I think it's called.
Yes. So I want to talk about sort of developing a sense of authority with a podcast, because I speak to a lot of people who are really interested in one. They really, really want to do one, but they're either sort of lacking a little bit of self-belief in that, well, who would want to listen to me? Or they're kind of thinking, well, who am I? You know, I'm not good enough. And I think every single one of them, we work on so much mindset work, every single one of them has that capacity and potential within them. How can they then, once they've launched, develop authority in their industry or niche?
I think the biggest thing I found is the power of association. And what I mean by that is bringing on guests who are so-called an authority in their space, whether it's podcasting or business or entrepreneurship or whatever space you're in. And because you're then associated to them sort of indirectly through your podcast, that authority kind of shines a light on you. So you don't necessarily have to have that experience in your space to begin with. You know, for me, I haven't ever had a business. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but at the same time, because I've brought people onto the show who do know what they're talking about, it means that I'm kind of associated with those people. And I now have lots of people outreaching to me saying, can I come on the podcast and talk about XYZ? Because I've seen, you know, people come on. Yeah. So I think that's certainly the main thing I do. And just on the thing, I think imposter syndrome, whatever you want to call it, it's something I face as well. I don't think any of us are immune to it. Loads of my guests I've spoken to have now got like £1 million businesses. They still have that as well. So I don't think it ever potentially goes away, but it's just kind of accepting that, okay, it's part of the human condition, if you like, and just kind of embracing it and actually not shying away from that and showing that vulnerability can actually be a strength. And that has certainly been something I've tried to focus on more and more of my content, and actually showing I don't have all the answers. I'm just kind of muddling through things, but hopefully together we can muddle through them and we can actually get to a place where we want to be. So those are the main things I think that have kind of helped or worked for me, at least.
I love them. And actually, I think when you are starting out, or, you know, whether it's a social media platform or a podcast, actually getting other guests into that network and actually interviewing them, and, you know, they then share that with their followers, and that's such a great way to start really growing an audience, isn't it?
100%, yeah. And just on that, actually, you don't even necessarily have to ask people to share content as well. I think something I found really useful is just kind of giving them the opportunity to share it, whether it's through Instagram, tagging them in stuff, or LinkedIn or email or whatever. But giving them those assets and those things, like, you know, to actually share that. And then if they want to share it, great. But if they don't, then that's fine as well. It's just not putting the pressure on yourself to ask people to share, because I think in some ways that actually makes people less likely to share. I don't know if you've had a similar experience with that, or just maybe that's just my mindset on it, but that's something I found.
Yeah, I've never asked somebody to share. I tag them like on all of the platforms, and generally they do share and say it was such an honour to be on the show. But I don't make it a sort of prerequisite that they have to share it, because I think, you know, if it's not in alignment with their audience, or if it's too conflicting, or, you know, for whatever reason they might not want to share it, I don't want to disallow them from appearing in my sort of platform, and actually potentially let my followers and listeners miss out on hearing what they've got to say just because they don't want to share it. So I agree. I like that. Okay, so how can you nurture new connections? So I get loads of DMs on Instagram now. When I launched my podcast back in April, it was very much social media through to podcast, and now it's going podcast and filtering through to social media. So I'm getting
Interesting.
from the podcast listenings. How can I start to nurture those new connections? Or for somebody that's completely just starting out, you know, what would you say to them about sort of nurturing new comments, new inquiries, new DMs, and new people that are sort of coming into that network?
Yeah, so a few things I do. One of those is usually with guests that have come onto the podcast or have kind of inquired to come onto the podcast. I have a kind of spreadsheet which just kind of tracks, okay, when did they reach out to me? When was the last time I contacted them? And it just kind of gives me a reminder to say, okay, I haven't spoken to this person in a very long time, maybe a few months. Maybe I should just actually check in with what they're doing. It doesn't have to be like messaging them directly, but just checking out their content, seeing what they're up to. So that's something I do quite strategically. But then kind of off the cuff stuff, it is literally just kind of what I mentioned earlier, actually, those 20 minutes of reach or kind of engaging in people's content. And typically the people I engage with the most kind of pop up the most in my feed. So, you know, on the Instagram stories or LinkedIn posts and stuff. So those tend to be the two main things that I do. And I think as well with podcast guests that come onto the show, I like to send them a book or a little token of appreciation because they've spent the time talking with you and actually sharing their knowledge and advice, and just a little gesture of like, okay, here's a copy of my favorite book. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I usually put like I do put like a bookmark in as well, which is my Entrepreneurs Can Party bookmark. Just a little gesture, but it's like, okay, you know, if you want to listen to the podcast again, you've got a reminder as well in a weird sort of way. But yeah, just showing you appreciation, always not taking people's time and generosity for granted. Always, I think those are the main things that I try and do as much as I can.
And I'd actually just like to add on to the end there. It's actually, you know, it's a two-way relationship, isn't it? So you very kindly have come as a guest onto my podcast. And then afterwards, I'm going to say, you know, is there anything I can do to support you? Is there anyone you need a connection to? You know, it's very much a two-way relationship. It's give and take, isn't it? It's not just, okay, what are you going to share with my audience? Okay, thank you, bye, and on your way. You know, actually, let's build a relationship here. Let's see what we can do to support each other. Because everybody knows somebody that I might want to connect with. You might know somebody, or I might know somebody that you want to connect with. And it's, you know, trying to see what you can do together and how you can help each other out, isn't it? Rather than just take all the time.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. And it's something happened fairly recent to me, I suppose. So one of my guests called Ronnie, she's an amazing email marketer and she works with huge clients and uses tools like HubSpot, I think it's called, and Infusionsoft, all those kind of automated tools. And one listener who listened to the podcast, she's like, oh, Ronnie sounds really cool. She reached out to me to actually ask, can I speak to Ronnie? I was like, yeah, of course you can, like just reach out to her. And then, you know, managed to introduce them, and now they're working together on our project. And the girl that reached out has actually since come onto the podcast. So it's funny how those connections can form. And like I say, if you can facilitate those as much as possible, make it a two-way street, it's beauty of podcasting. That's why I love it so much.
Yeah, I love it. Some of the people I've met and the stories I've heard just in the 4 months since I launched my podcast, just incredible. And now I listen to one every single day without fail. Just gives me inspiration and motivation, and, you know, just goes in so subconsciously. And I love that you can just take them anywhere with you, can't you? It's not like a video where you sit down and you generally have to like watch it and engage with it. They're just, you know, it's in the pockets. It's in everybody's life. It's on their phone. Everybody's always got their phone on them. And it's just got such massive potential, hasn't it? So if someone was on the fence thinking, oh, shall I launch one? Shall I not? You know, are they too big? Are they too everywhere right now? What would be your advice to them?
It's a great question. It's one actually I asked a guy called JLD. I mentioned him before, actually, JLD, because he's got a very successful podcast. And I was like, you know, is it too late if people miss the boat on podcasting? And he gave a really interesting answer. And it was potentially, So not to be like a Debbie Downer on it, but you know, this idea that you can kind of produce a show and like put it out there and it's going to get thousands of listens and downloads instantly. Obviously it doesn't quite happen like that. You've got to put in a lot of work and you're not guaranteed to get there. Something he said that he did very early on was actually find a niche. And I know we hear this in like business all the time. It's like, okay, find your niche, find your USP, what makes your show or your product different. And he said, do that with a podcast. And actually, you know, what are you bringing different to the party? Pardon the pun. Or what are you like, what is your area of expertise that you can kind of bring to this space? So for him, it was this idea that his podcast was the first daily podcast in entrepreneurship. So every single day he was interviewing like really cool, inspiring entrepreneurs, people like Pat Flynn and Gary Vee. And he was, you know, having that energy and actually showing people what's possible. So that's what he did, made it a daily show, which was the first of its kind. I guess what I've tried to do, maybe unsuccessfully, I'm not too sure yet, is actually kind of bring people onto the podcast who are kind of relatable. And actually, you know, I love the really motivating stories of people who have kind of made it big and, you know, £1 million businesses, £1 billion businesses, whatever. But for the average Joe listening to the podcast, it's almost can seem a little bit intimidating, a bit overwhelming. So I was like, okay, how can I bring people on who are still really successful in their own rights? And, you know, they're living their dream lives, but actually they're more relatable in the sense that you can reach out to them on Instagram or LinkedIn or email even, and just say, hey, really like the show. And they'll actually get back to you, as opposed to people maybe not being able to do that. So that was what I tried to bring to the podcast. And I guess the thing I'd say to people like looking to start a podcast is, of course, you know, you don't have to do that. It depends how big you want your podcast to get. Like ultimately for me, I'd love to do this full time. It's kind of one of my dreams, if you like. So in that sense, I've tried to take it more seriously and, you know, tried to give it the best chance of success as it can. At the same time, some of my mates have launched, very recently launched a podcast on Spotify. And actually it's just them having a laugh. They don't really want it to get big or anything. It's just them dicking about really. So, you know, it just depends what you want. And if you do want to kind of go down that more quote unquote professional route, then yeah, maybe have a think about, okay, how can you make your show different? Can you maybe have a different format? You know, does it have to be a guest, you know, an interview? Can you have it a solo episode? Can you have it with co-hosts? Just kind of experiment a little bit and see what feels comfortable for you, because ultimately the only way you're going to keep going at a podcast is if you're enjoying it and actually you've got that motivation to keep doing it. So yeah, find your thing that you enjoy doing. What makes you different? You know, is it the format of the show? Is it what you're talking about? You know, is it dog training, for example, or is it, you know, something a bit more niche like that? Have a think about those things. And I think then you've got a good chance of making podcast a success.
And is there a sort of perfect amount of episodes you should do per month? Or is it completely varying?
I think personally, I think it varies. So I've asked a lot of people about this because I was very aware of the fact that actually, you know, there's so much like how long is a piece of rope? You know, some people have a daily podcast. Some people release an episode once a month, others like twice a week. I don't think there's any kind of set in stone. The one thing I would say is make sure you're consistent. So if you say you're going to release an episode once a week, then make sure you do that and actually do release it once a week. Or if it's once a month, make sure you do that. If it's daily, again, do that. I think, you know, obviously there's a lot of podcasters who do like serial or series podcasts. So they have, say, 6 to 10 episodes and then stop for a few months and then start up again. And I think, again, there's nothing wrong with that. For me personally, I wanted it to be kind of an ongoing podcast so that people could listen to it all year round. I think from an SEO perspective, it has the benefits of, you know, if you're putting that website on your content, putting that content on your website particularly, then it kind of keeps that your website fresh, and actually it gives Google something to crawl and hold on to. So if you're looking to maybe do a serial podcast, maybe just consider, okay, make your audience aware from the onset there's going to be a serial podcast, and you might have a few month break, you know, halfway through or whatever. So yeah, and to answer to your question, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it just depends on what you're comfortable with and what you can commit to. And ultimately consistency is the name of the game of podcasting, no matter what consistency that is for you.
Just as it is with social media.
Exactly right, exactly right.
So I always wrap up an interview with asking somebody what is the one thing they wish they knew sooner, generally in life or business. So what would that one thing be for you?
I think for me, this has actually been a very recent revelation, i.e. like the last week. And that is not to put too much pressure on myself. I think I've always had something I'm trying to striving towards, whether it's the podcast or I've got a few other projects on the go relating to Amazon FBA and XYZ. And it's like, okay, am I actually happy right now? Am I content? If I am, you don't have to put so much pressure on yourself, Scott. Like, take your time. You're still only like young, you could do nothing for the next 5 years and still be young. So just like give yourself a break. And like I said, that's been a very recent revelation. And actually reading a book called Awareness by Anthony DeMello, which is fantastic. Recommended it to so many of my friends recently. It is just so many lessons and so like eye-opening. And it definitely gets you to think about what it is you want from your life, like on a deep level, but even day-to-day stuff. It's like, okay, who do you want to associate yourself with and what are you working towards? So yeah, that would be the thing I tell myself, like, take the pressure off yourself. You don't have to, you don't have to put that pressure on you to achieve next month. It can be a longer process than that.
That's such a good takeaway, such a good note to end on, because we do put so much pressure on ourselves, don't we? And I'm the worst for it. My business coach voice noted me on Instagram this morning, said, just take the pressure off for August. I'm like, I just want to keep like growing and striving. And it is so true. And I think as soon as you do and you get yourself like more into flow and abundance, and actually that's when you'll be more creative. That's when the good stuff can flow. And it just comes from that realization that it is okay to take the pressure off yourself, because not a lot's going to change until you do. So that is an amazing key takeaway. Thank you. Where can our listeners and viewers find you on the internet?
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on, Tara. It's been so much fun chatting with you. The best place would probably be my website. So you can find links to the podcast and other blog posts that I've done into how to hire a VA, if that's something of interest to your listeners, or how to get into the top 10 in 6 days. So there's kind of more detailed breakdown of that. I think it's like 7,000 word blog posts, almost as long as my dissertation, but it's like, okay, step by step, this is how you do it. So if people want to check that out, then scottstockdale.co.uk/trailer is probably the best place to go. And you can also check out a cheeky trailer of Entrepreneurs Can Party to, because I appreciate it's a lot of commitment listening to a new podcast, if it's a 30-40 minute episode. So that's just like a couple of minutes, gives a flavour of who the guests I've had on the show, what it's all about. So that would be the place to go, scottstockdale.co.uk/trailer.
Amazing. And I will pop the links to your website and all of your Instagram channels in the show notes. Thank you so much for chatting today. It's been so interesting, and it just got me even more excited for more future episodes of Tara Talks that are to follow. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, keep up the great work as well. You've done amazing in such a short space of time. So yeah, persistence is the key.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.